Okay, so let's get started. Julian already kindly introduced me, so we can skip this introduction. But what I will say is, for my PhD research, I spent 5 years in settings where internet policy was being discussed and followed a number of activists, youth and feminist activists, who were advocating for internet access for different communities. And what I was looking at really were the discussions about internet access policy in these spaces. So you can think of spaces like the United Nations. Were they really serving the needs and interests of different communities? And if they weren't, what interests and communities were they serving? And some of my findings have informed the work that I've subsequently been doing around this idea of digital colonialism, which is a whole literature that has emerged in the last sort of 7 years around power and the internet. So what we're going to cover today is a bit more focused on the United States context, because I'm based here in Chicago. I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of digital redlining, which refers to certain areas not receiving the same level of access as others. I'll talk about how we've gone about measuring the problem of internet performance and the inequalities in that. And then I'll touch a little bit around this idea of decoloniality, which is a theoretical framework. And then from there, I'll talk about this methodology that we're now developing to take our research further. So the kind of main components of internet access include a range of things, and I'll go through them, but as you can see, I've bolded 3 at the top because those are going to be the main ones that I focus on. So the built infrastructure itself, that refers to the wires, the cables, the undersea infrastructure. It might be wireless distribution, so not just in your router, but also from outside where you're using towers. It might be that you have cables that are hanging rather than under the ground, depending on the environment you're in and how much people wanted to spend. And then within that, there's also different technologies of delivery have different levels of service. So fiber optic cable is considered the kind of most robust and the highest performing and the most future-proof as well. And then there's availability of service. So there actually might be infrastructure available, but there may not be a service provider that's willing to take it from what we call the middle mile to home. And that means from the street to my house. And then we have the quality and reliability of service. So does my connection drop frequently? Do we have outages? Is it slower at times and higher speed at other times? And then once you kind of move past the more technical aspects, then we have actually, can anyone really afford a plan? Here in the United States, we have some of the most expensive broadband plans in the world. And it was a real shock to me moving from the United Kingdom to go from paying, £25 a month for my internet plan to plans upwards of $100 being quite common. And then on top of that, you actually need to have a device to be able to fully use internet services. And I say that devices need to be up to date because, of course, as things develop online, you need to be able to keep up with that, with the abilities of your device. And with that comes skills that are also up to date, because if you don't have skills that are relevant to the current technologies, then again, you're not really able to do very much. And finally, there's motivation. Do people actually want to use the internet? So there's a whole range of different things here. But yeah, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on the first 3, but I will also flag that they do all interact with each other. So if we are kind of measuring internet performance, we kind of have to go through these various layers of how good is the device? What kind of plan is the person on? How is the quality of the service from the provider? What technology does the provider use? So you can see how there's a whole kind of host of things that impact the quality of performance. Now, here in the US, since the pandemic, internet access has become a really big topic. And that's because people were more reliant on doing things remotely and one of the key things that came up here was because a lot of people in different places didn't have good quality broadband in the home, children weren't able to go to school remotely in some places. And one of the big things here is also there is quite stark segregation within cities, and that's often quite racially undertoned, and we're going to come to redlining. But that means that you'll see these kind of swathes of population that weren't having the same access as other swathes of population. And so it was really noticeable that children couldn't learn remotely in one part of the city and could learn remotely in another part of the city. But not just, education, there's also remote work and healthcare. All of these things became more commonplace during the pandemic. And that policy area really started to develop. And so you can see I've got some headlines here on the right. Quite a substantial amount of funding was put aside to close this gap in infrastructure in particular. You've got some different figures there. There's the 42 billion that is going towards one particular policy, which is the Broadband Equity Deployment and Access Fund. And that's really focused on developing out infrastructure. And then the 90 billion refers to a range of other policies. And one of the things I've had to kind of get my head around as I've come into this work is just how much different money is coming from different pots and different agencies focusing on this. And I'll say it's not always particularly coordinated how those efforts are working. And we also have to consider there's so many states and territories here, and that, there's the state level and also the federal level. And so funding is kind of coming at this issue from different directions. And each of those funding sources has different rules attached to it as well. So quite a lot of complexity, but there is this goal to broaden out infrastructure. Now, I mentioned redlining, and this map here is a really good indication of how redlining is still relevant. Now, for those who are not familiar, redlining was a practice that was quite commonplace that saw financial institutions essentially choosing places on the map that were largely occupied by African American residents, and downgrading them as areas that shouldn't have access to financial services, in particular credit. And this was a common practice. It was considered to be fine, a way of mitigating risk, but since then has become illegal. But of course, the impacts of that remain and really are quite visible in these two maps that we have here. So the first one with the red areas showing areas that were redlined, and then if we look at social vulnerability, that can follow some of those similar maps. And if we also think about the demographics of those places, they also follow quite similar lines in the senses that racialized groups tend to live in some of those neighborhoods as well, even now. So one of the things my research group, and I will introduce them shortly, it's called the Internet Equity Initiative, has been looking at is this idea of digital redlining, which has been present in the literature, particularly here in the US for some time, as a kind of idea, which is that where in the past we've seen financial institutions kind of excluding places in cities, is it now the case that internet service providers are following those patterns and not serving neighborhoods that were previously redlined and are now kind of enacting their own kind of digital redlining? And so my group has developed internet measurement devices, which we've tried to place in different locations within the north side and the south side of Chicago. And this is a map of Chicago, I should have said. It's long and thin because it's bordering on the eastern side, Lake Michigan. Traditionally kind of the northern side of the city has seen kind of more white residents, and then the south and west sides have seen more racialized and Black and Latino residents. And so we've tried to contrast internet performance on the north side with that on the south side in our kind of preliminary study, to look at whether we're seeing digital redlining actually happening in the kind of performance that people are receiving. And obviously, you wouldn't just need to look at performance, you could also look at different metrics. For example, what kind of broadband plans are available. Another thing we've heard anecdotally is that the cost is a lot higher in some of these redlined areas. We've heard reliability is worse. And so those are the kinds of claims that we're looking to explore and quantify. So going back to the funding that I mentioned, the issue that we have is once you kind of put aside this big funding pot of 42 billion, 90 billion, we're confronted with the task of actually allocating that funding. And as I mentioned, it's a complex environment that we're working with here. We're working with states, and then within that, there's a big divide between more rural areas and urban areas. And the rural areas are not easy to connect in terms of their geography. I think back to the United Kingdom, much smaller country, getting infrastructure around, we don't have enormous mountain ranges or huge valleys or enormous wildernesses. We're not dealing with acres and acres and acres of forest. And here we have all of that. We have all of that. So the environment into which we're deploying the funding is complicated. And to kind of establish where infrastructure needs to develop, the Federal Communications Commission has initially started by developing a map. And the map has been populated initially with information from internet service providers about where they believe that they provide service. And this has been highly contentious because there have been many, many instances, and I've gone through this in my own field work, where they claim to be providing service, but when it comes to customers and residents, they're reporting that they can't get service, or that the service that they receive is incredibly poor in terms of the standard. One of the research sites that I work with is a place called Beaver Island, which is an island in the middle of Lake Michigan. And the lake is not a small lake, it's an enormous lake. And Beaver Island, every day I get messages from them saying, oh, we've had an outage, our service is incredibly slow. And so it's not even meeting the standards that are required by federal policy in terms of this funding allocation. So they're going through a process state by state where there's this map that's been produced by internet service providers about where they say that they serve. And the process in each state is that the map's being presented to residents and they're being asked to, if they don't receive what is being claimed, to challenge the map. Now, you can imagine how complex this becomes because firstly, you have to get the information out that this challenge process is happening. Secondly, the windows of time within which people need to challenge being marked as served are quite small. And lastly, the actual process by which they submit a challenge to say, actually, this isn't the service that I'm getting is quite convoluted. They need to take 3 speed tests on 3 different days, but the days have to be consecutive. And then they need to submit those speeds via a form along with what they say they pay for. So the steps involved, there are many. And the process has not happened through all the states at the moment, but it's happened in the state where I live, which is Illinois. And it's happened in another state where I'm researching, which is Michigan, which is a state next to Illinois. And the responses have not been many. The challenges have not been many, and actually the acceptance of challenges has been quite limited. So it's been a contentious process, and the allocation of funding is not going to go down well, however it ends up happening. Going back to what we are working on here then. So the Internet Equity Initiative, as I mentioned, is an interdisciplinary research group. We have 2 PIs, Professor Nicole Marwell, who is a sociologist and a geographer, and Professor Nick Feimster, who's a computer scientist. And so, you've got two very different ways of looking at the world, two very different ways of doing research. And then we have me, and I'm a media and communication scholar that works mostly with ethnographic methods. And we have a range of other people that work in the team who have, skill sets in between all of these. And the things that we look at are opportunities for internet measurement, performance measurement, and that is headed up by Professor Feimster. And that's kind of computational, where we're collecting data about performance. And then we have efforts towards community engagement for the communities here in Chicago that potentially don't have good internet access. And we also have policy research, which is something that I'm heading up through a study funded by the National Science Foundation here. And one thing I will say is our research has involved a lot of work in Chicago itself, because the University of Chicago is located on the south side of Chicago, which is one of these areas that has experienced historical disadvantage, and is predominantly resident to African American and Latino populations. So, we're right in the middle of, it's actually very stark to observe, because the University of Chicago, very well regarded institution, has a lot of money and is kind of located in a neighborhood which does have good access. But as you start to leave the neighborhood, firstly, all kinds of infrastructure starts to drop off, and I'm talking about public transport, I'm talking about the quality of the roads, but then internet access also starts to drop off. And so we are well placed here to really look at this issue, and it is a very pressing issue for us. Now, so the way that we do this internet performance measurement is through the use of a Raspberry Pi, a picture of one there. And we ask residents who want to take part in the study to plug one of these into their router for a period of 3 to 6 months. And what the Raspberry Pi will do is to take measurements of internet performance over time at regular intervals, and then it shares that information directly back with our research team. And so in that way, it's beneficial, because rather than a speed test that just happens once, and it could happen, depending on the time of day, it's going to impact some of the results. Our device will take measurements at different times through the day, but also over several months. And so if there's, for example, seasonal changes, my research site that I mentioned, Beaver Island, has a lot more residents over the summer than it does in the winter. Those seasonal changes can also be represented in the data. So we get a much more robust picture of what internet performance looks like. But let me foreshadow some of the problems here. How would you feel? Let me put this to you. How would you feel about plugging a small black box into your internet router? Little blinking light watching you. I'll let you think about that. So yeah, our residents, even if they were reporting poor internet connectivity, have been reluctant to host the device. And I've put some of the reasons on the slide here. And they might resonate with you as well. You might feel the same. Are you going to be watching what I'm doing on the internet? That's the first concern. There's concerns about privacy and surveillance here. These are residents also that have been around the university for some time, and I'll say this: the University of Chicago has expanded over the years that it's been in this location, and it has made promises to residents to kind of not expand into these kind of other neighborhoods around it, but it's continued to do so. And so there has been a difficult relationship between residents and the university, and that's been ongoing. People are kind of a bit more suspicious of potentially researchers coming in and being quite extractive in terms of like doing the research and then it never really leading to anything. And going out to and speaking to people, I would say that's one of the main things that came up. They said, there's no point in taking part. We do, the university's there, and I imagine these residents have been approached before for research, They say,
I've done this before. Nothing ever really amounts to anything for me. I never really get anything out of the research. So why should I take part? Why should I host this device? And actually, even giving them a $50 Amazon voucher as a kind of incentive has not really helped to recruit people. Which brings us to an important kind of juncture in our work, which is what happens when we're trying to do research as usual, as we've always known to do it. And communities have actually said, no, we're not gonna do this. This isn't acceptable to us. We want to do things differently, and they are setting boundaries, and they are setting things that they want if they're to take part, you know. And that has been something that, rather than kind of working around it or not really looking closely at it, we've decided to look very, very closely at some of those reasons and learn from the feedback and reorient how we're approaching the problem. Because that, you know, to me as a researcher who works with decolonial frameworks and receiving that kind of feedback, I think it's important to see that as research data in a way. That is people sharing their feelings, and we can use that to redevelop a methodology, in my mind, that takes those things into account rather than kind of ploughing on with this research as usual approach. And so, coming with the kind of background that I have, we are looking to do this using decolonizing frameworks. And I will just stop for a second on terminology here. So decolonizing, when I talk about decolonizing frameworks, I am kind of using it as an umbrella term to refer to different schools of thought. Decoloniality being one of them, which I'm about to go into, but also post-coloniality, anti-colonialism. So that's the kind of broad term, decolonizing politics or a decolonizing approach. But decoloniality, which is one of the areas that I focus on most, and I apologize for all of the same word coming up again and again because it's hard to get your head around sometimes, was developed by Latin American thinkers, and decoloniality opposes what is defined as coloniality. And that's different to colonialism in the sense that that is actually the social relations that underpin colonialism, whether that be historical colonialism that's seen independence for certain countries, or whether that be continual colonialism that's happening today in settler colonies, you know, like the United States. And coloniality is the kind of underpinnings of historical and current colonialism. So it's allowed the justification of going to other parts of the world and colonizing them. So it's a way of thinking in that sense. And some of the kind of elements of coloniality include the classification of humanity in a racialized system that puts white Europeans at the top. It includes thinking about society as being on a linear trajectory towards progress, and that looking like the model that we've seen in Europe. And obviously, if you kind of look at society in that way, you kind of put Europe and European societies at the kind of apex of civilization, and then you place the rest of the world behind that. And so there's a kind of temporal element to the way the world is ordered, but then also a geographic element in the sense that parts of the world that are populated by different societies, according to this kind of racialized hierarchy that, as I mentioned, puts Europeans at the top and Afro-descendant Black people at the bottom, that also gets mapped onto the world. And actually, you know, we see that playing out in the map that I showed you of Chicago as well. So coloniality is important to consider as the and I find this helpful, it's kind of the other side of the coin to modernity. And so if we think of modernity as the kind of values of rationality, of progress, of individualism, coloniality is the kind of other side to that. And you can't have modernity without coloniality. So you can't have visions of development and European society being civilized if you don't have a vision of other societies not being civilized. And what's interesting about decoloniality, this particular approach, is that it really takes very, very seriously the kinds of knowledge that justify certain things happening in the world. So it takes note that in the centering of Western ways of thinking, rationality, progress, what I just mentioned, we also denigrate other ways of thinking. So perhaps that's spiritualities from different parts of the world. Perhaps that's the role of feelings in knowledge making. So we value certain types of making knowledge and the knowledges that they create, and we give them a kind of power in that sense. And we also disempower other ways of thinking and knowledge making. And obviously we see this play out in academia a lot when, for example, when I go to campus, I work between the computer science building and the School of Social Policy. And you can just kind of see it very starkly. The computer science building is very flashy, they have a lot of money. And then I go to the social policy building and it's a lot more, what's the word? Toned down. So even there, the way that we fetishize certain types of knowledge is very visible. So that's decoloniality, and that's kind of one of the main ways of thinking that have framed the approach that we've kind of developed to move forward. So what we want from a methodology, this is kind of like our shopping list going forward, is we want it to be more collaborative. And you can look at this in the context of some of that feedback that I showed you earlier, these bits of feedback. So we want, rather than moving from a research agenda that we've just developed in our literal ivory tower in the middle of these neighborhoods, we want to consider actually what is it that our communities want to know about internet inequality, moving from a kind of inquiry defined by us to a collaborative inquiry. We want to move away from being seen as this kind of extractive force that goes in, takes some data, takes some information, and doesn't really give anything back, to trying to share the resources that we have. And it's a very wealthy university. We have resources that would be very valuable to those around us. We want to be able to share the knowledge that we generate openly. We're not going to just put it immediately behind, these journals that people can't access unless they have access to them through institutions like the university. We want to be able to make sure that they can actually see what the outcomes are. We want to use our profile as a university to bring attention to the issue in the community and see if we can get more eyes on it to actually make a difference. And then we want to focus on the lived experience of people that actually do have to deal with this internet inequality every day. And we want to be able to do that in their voice as well, so that they're able to express what they're feeling. And this kind of goes back to what I said in terms of the kinds of knowledge that are valued. When we have the internet measurement device and we kind of quantify what is happening in terms of the data, that is the kind of knowledge that is valued in a lot of settings, because it's quantitative and it's considered to be reliable and generalizable. But alongside that, we want to be able to bring, actually, what does that mean for people's real lives in their voice to these same settings? And then we don't just want to diagnose the problem, actually. We don't want to just say, this is what people are experiencing and this is an issue. We want to make space for people to envision, okay, what could be a solution?
in an ideal world, what would connectivity look like for you? What would you do with that? What would it mean for you? And that is because often people that are involved in this kind of research, they only really get asked about their experiences, but never about what could be a potential solution. They're not considered a site of wisdom and a site of knowledge in that way. And finally, we want to make space for our collaborators in the community to actually hear about the research and then respond to it and say, I agree with that, I don't agree with that, because often that's not the case. Often researchers will kind of go in, make their decisions, and then leave, and people will not get the opportunity to kind of respond to what's being said about them. And I think that's particularly important for me as well, because I'm not from here. I moved to Chicago in January, and I don't feel like I am qualified to talk about people's experiences without letting them actually respond to what I've said. So going forward, whereas let's say previously our question was more about internet performance and metrics and data, we've really broadened out the question that we're taking into the community. We want to know what are people's lived experiences of these internet inequities that they report, and we also want to think about possible solutions to overcoming these issues. And so the project that we've developed that we're hoping to take out into the community is one that centers around artistic creation. One thing I noticed as soon as I moved here is the amount of creativity in the city, but particularly concentrated in some of these neighborhoods that are referred to and that have been historically redlined. And what we want to do is commission local artists to produce works in the city of Chicago, but also in the city of Detroit, which is, I haven't mentioned, but is another one of the research sites that I'm working in. And there's another city in the upper Midwest, about 5 hours drive away from Chicago. We want to commission artists from areas that experience internet inequality to produce works on that theme, about their experiences and about their future visions for connectivity. And this comes from me sitting with people and saying, here's a black box, why don't you plug it in? And people saying, having all these kind of worries and fears that they ascribe to the black box, right? And I was thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if we could almost open up what's in the box for you, right? Like, what are you imagining in that box? What fears of yours are inside that box? And we felt like an exhibition that is made up of works from artists from these communities would enable that kind of expression of lived experience, and also that opportunity to envision what the future would be like in a way that does not require a huge amount of, technical knowledge. I mean, people might have technical knowledge and expertise for sure within these communities, but they may not, and you don't need it. And in a way that the outputs will also not require technical knowledge or specific knowledge to be able to understand. If you see a painting or a sculpture or a drawing, you can kind of understand the themes and the meaning and even discuss it, quite comfortably, even if you don't have knowledge about what the background of that piece is. And so in that way, it's very, our goal is to make it very accessible so that we can reach different types of stakeholders within the communities, but also within the kind of internet governance environment. So our goal is, again, responding to people saying there's never really anything that comes out of research that's beneficial for me or for our community. The way that we're tackling that is we want to be able to invite people who are policymakers, who are internet service providers into the gallery space, into the exhibition space, to be confronted with some of that information. And we're doing that through a number of kind of stakeholder engagement events. And for the research side of things, I'll be conducting ethnographic research throughout the whole process. So from the recruitment of artists into the exhibition, into the stakeholder events, and to the end. And we're not just considering the ethnographic research as research, the artworks themselves will also be considered research, because of course they very much are, in the sense that they are expressing, conveying these experiences of internet constrainment. So this is just showing an outline of the kind of process that we're going to go through. Initially, we'll have a call for artists, and that's going to be an open call. And to take part, artists will be invited to submit a statement of intent about what they'd like to do. And that can be through video, through audio, through text, whatever is most comfortable for them, as well as some of the previous works that they have produced. We'll then go through a period of selection where we'll go through all of the applicants, and we have a panel made up of different stakeholders, including members from the community who will be involved in that. And then artists who have been selected will work with our research group, and we'll have some workshops where they'll be kind of introduced to some of the themes, and to the extent to which they're interested as well. We'll be able to share with them our data, our maps of kind of internet as it kind of looks at the moment, our ethnographic recordings, a whole range of research findings that we have. And they'll have access to that throughout the period during which they'll be producing works. And we have set aside significant funding for artists to go through this process, be that the workshops and also the production of the works themselves. And at the moment, we're trying to put together the funding for this project. And I'll say this much, that where we've gone out with the budget and mentioned how much we want to pay the artists, we've had some resistance where research institutions are just not used to paying people for their labor. And I've had to really make the case for saying no. Like, one of the kind of goals of this is a decolonial framework where we're saying we want to, it's a decolonial framework where we're saying we want to actually take material resources that we have as an institution and put them into these communities, because the difference is so stark. And the communities can see that. They can see that this very ornate building, this huge campus with its beautifully manicured lawns and, you know, very old looking architecture and expensive equipment and quantum computing lab that's being built. They can see all that. And they can also see us going empty-handed to them and saying, hey, will you do this for free? Or will you do this for tiny amount of money? And so we really need to change how we're seen in the community as this kind of vampiric force that only acts as trying to, in our own interests, without really ever sharing the resources that we have. So I've set aside a budget for artists to go away and do that. And then there's also an exhibition which will take place in a local venue. And again, setting aside a significant amount of budget for that, so that we have a lasting effect for that local art institution, so that they can do things that they have wanted to do, as well as hosting this exhibition. So once the exhibition's in place, we're going to have 3 key events, and those are going to be exchanges between different stakeholder groups. One of them is between artists and researchers from different disciplines. And the goal there is, you know, even we as researchers we can get a little bit focused on one idea or one problem, and we need our minds expanded as well. And so the goal there is to look to artists from these communities to help us to kind of consider, is our research agenda, is the research agenda that we're looking at really the right agenda, or is there other opportunities here? So that's the researchers and artists. And then there'll be another exchange event with artists and policymakers and also industry people. So that, again, trying to open up their minds as well. And then the last exchange is here we have a group of civil society organizations called the Chicago Digital Equity Coalition, and it's run by the city government, and we'll be hosting an event for them in the space again to try and expand our thinking for us all to learn together. I'm a member of that coalition as well, and to consider how that can inform our strategy going forward as a group that is trying to bring about digital equity in the city. And as well as that, there's a whole range of public engagements that we're looking to do as well. And then, of course, we'll be analysing our findings, and we'll be finishing by, as I mentioned, presenting back to the communities through contacting people who attended the exhibition and saying, this is the research that we've put together. Talk back to us. Do you agree? Do you not agree? So as I mentioned, we've centred art to move away from this idea that these communities have nothing but lap. You know, these communities have nothing to offer, and actually they are just receptacles into which we need to put resource. This is a kind of subverting that way of thinking and saying actually these are communities that have a huge abundance of resources, in the sense that there's creativity, and there's been political resistance, and they are very tightly knit in some places, and they have all kinds of different community organising strategies. So what can we learn there? As I mentioned, it doesn't require any kind of technical, I've gone over that before, it doesn't require expertise, it's accessible. And even when we're bringing in, we also want to bring in audiences from the local area in terms of adults and children to be in the space and learn more about this area of social development. We want to make it as accessible as possible. And the idea is that one thing that's lacking is that we consider these different areas of social development that are much more mature, in the sense that they've been around for a long time. I'll give an example: housing or food insecurity. But this area of social development, when it comes to internet, quality of internet, which does inflect so many other areas of life, is less developed. And so we're hoping to, through the exhibition, to build that awareness of that as a social issue. And there's three key themes that are kind of guiding our thinking around this, and how we want the exhibition to work. And you can kind of look these up, I won't go into too much detail, but they're important concepts for how we're structuring the work, which is delinking. And that comes from Walter Mignolo, who is a decolonial thinker. And that is moving away from traditional forms of academic production. So instead of kind of valuing those traditional forms, we're actually thinking about other ways of producing knowledge and other concepts. Second is dialogue. So as I mentioned, we're not just putting what we want into the world here, we're in a dialogue with the communities, and we have a shared point of inquiry, which is, what does internet inequality mean for people? And lastly, an idea of speculation. So making space to speculate on what the future could look like, but at the same time making space to speculate on how the past has informed the current. And our hopes for the research is that we're going to learn more about people's experiences. We're going to open up thinking. We're going to hopefully have an impact on the kind of policy space here in the city of Chicago and also in the city of Detroit, around the valuing of internet inequality and how it's tackled. And we're also going to be exploring actually if there even is a place for measurement, as we've done it in the past, within this holistic research agenda, because as I mentioned, measurement was very central to our approach before, but the reason why we even came to this in the first place is because it wasn't really working. We weren't able to get people to engage with it. And now that we have got to a place, if we do this research and we do develop those ties with the community, is it the case that measurement is more acceptable and accepted, or is it the case that actually that's fundamentally something that people are not willing to engage with? And that brings me to the end. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. Got lots of comments in the chat. Pete then has been offering a kind of theoretical interaction with your talk as we've been going, and there's a really useful link there from a research centre in Vancouver on ethical ethical principles in research as well. But there are no actual questions as such. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask rather than a comment? If not, I have one. So I'm going to pause for a few seconds to allow somebody else who's not. Gianfranco, yes, please, ask away.
Yes, well, I have a question. Yes, I mean, this was really interesting, Hannah. Lovely to meet you, and thanks for this interesting presentation. A lot of like also overlap with kind of the work that I do as well, which relates to issues of digital inequalities, digital inclusion, and digital literacy as well. And a question that I have for you is around this idea of creating a new kind of, creating novel methodologies that can allow us to sort of like challenge, pre-existing power structures that really determine the ways in which we create knowledge. And I myself have been working on, also novel approaches in terms of methodologies. And I think that there's a lot that, comes from like adopting elements of participatory action research, that I think that can be really, really valuable. That sort of very much overlaps with what you're talking about, right? I have myself been involved in working in like participatory action research projects. And one of the challenges that I have encountered personally, for example, has been the fact that, I really like the slide when you were talking about how it's important to connect with the community, allow them to express their own voices and priorities and concerns, and then to bring to connect all of that with policymakers and stakeholders and people that sort of have a role to play. But I think that is ideally what we should do as researchers. Although having worked on some of these participatory projects, I have myself noticed, for example, that sometimes it's hard to not to overpromise participants when they're getting involved in these projects, because they think that through these projects you will be able to address a lot of issues that are important to them, and so I think that's one limitation in itself. And then another one is precisely when it comes to then connecting all of that with with stakeholders and trying to have an impact. That sort of impact is not necessarily always guaranteed, right? Because as researchers, we have the role of amplifying the voices of different communities if we can. And I think using decolonial approaches and participatory methods can be very helpful. But ultimately, the best we can do is to facilitate conversation that potentially can make that happen, but we cannot be 100% sure that will happen, right? So I was just wondering whether these are limitations that you've encountered as well, and whether you have any tips or thoughts around how we can mitigate in the future, against this risk. And yeah.
Yeah, I think those are really, really important points, and definitely resonate with both of them. In terms of the overpromising, so I think one of the challenges that the kind of research prior to me joining has had is that people do feel like they have done something when they've taken part in the research, and so there's always an expectation there that it will lead to some kind of change, because they've kind of actually surpassed quite a significant concern of theirs, which is to plug in this box. And they've had it for a significant period of time as well, so they do feel like there should be some kind of outcome. And the kind of workaround for that I've been thinking of is really working with local organizing to pass the baton, as it were, so that when we have to step out of the picture, local organizers can use the research that we've produced, and also they've been introduced to the actors that can make a difference, and so that they can then take on the mantle of continuing their organizing, and they know who to target.
That's very helpful. Yes, thanks.
Thank you. We have a hard end with these talks because we don't want to take for granted our speakers' time any more than we already do, but it's not quite 3 p.m. So if we squeeze a question in before the hour turns, we can do it. Does anyone have a question they could ask super quickly? If not, I was going to ask you one, but it was quite similar. I'm going to ask you one very quick one. What would be for a new researcher starting out who needs to develop a research career and then in that sense almost kind of play the game as it is in order to advance with their career, but absolutely gets your principles for decolonial ethics, for want of a better expression, what would be your one kind of tip for how to ensure that the decolonial impulse is a first principle?
Get a copy of Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Weiss-Smith and read it cover to cover. That's my top tip.
That works, especially as our MA students have been set that chapter 8 of that for their reading for our seminar weeks. That's a very nice way of finishing the talk. Thank you again so much. That's fantastic. I'll stop recording.